What's up guys? Welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to be doing an experiment that I've wanted to try for a very long time now, and that is putting crushed opal in resin and making a ring out of it. And I know it technically is possible, but will it actually look good? That's the question we're going for here. There's a couple different styles I want to try, and they're all going to have their own benefits. So the first is going to be a fine sand, particles that are about 1 millimeter in size, not a lot larger, not a lot smaller. That will allow us to add additives like glow powder and maybe have some interesting results where you've got this amazing, super colorful iridescent ring in the day that also glows at night. And then the other variation I want to try is doing a very, very fine powder that we can actually suspend and get to float in the resin and produce effects similar to this. This is a material called opalite. It's got a very just amazing, it's almost like a ghosty color shift that it has. Very awesome, amazing properties. We're going to be trying to emulate as much of that as we can. Let's go ahead and get started. All right, we're on to our first step, and that's going to be crushing down our larger opal fragments into smaller sizes and sifting them by size. And this is actually a really important step. It's going to play a critical role in achieving the overall look of our finished rings. Now remember, we're doing 2 rings here. The first one I'm going to be using medium-sized fragments on. That's going to give us the look we want. Anything bigger than this and you'd run the risk of having a piece that's so big that it essentially creates a fracture through the ring where there's not enough resin to completely engulf it, and you could have a ring that's prone to cracking. And then anything smaller than it, then you're not going to have enough gaps in the ring for the resin to fill in and get that glow powder in there, which you'll see at the end of this video. It makes a massive difference. The look of the ring is amazing. We want as much glow as we can get. So we want medium fragments for this first one, and then for the second one, we want the smallest pieces we can get. What we want is essentially just a bunch of dust suspended in resin that'll give us that nice iridescent shimmer. And this process is fairly tedious, but it's very straightforward. I just kept at it for about 30 minutes or so, and then we're left with enough material for each of the rings. Now on to the resin casting steps. I'm going to be using my Astro jewelry grade epoxy for this. I'll mix it up in a 1:1 ratio, and then I'll portion it out into 2 separate containers, one for each ring. Now in one of the cups I put a lot less epoxy, and that's because we're going to be using so much opal in there that it's actually going to fill in and make up the difference. And then because we want this one to glow in the dark, obviously, we're just using some of our Astro Dust Strontium Illuminate Aqua Glow Powder for this. This is going to have a really nice balance of glow brightness as well as glow duration. This is going to look awesome in the dark. Now it's time to go ahead and sprinkle in the opal fragments. I'm going to be adding a lot here. I want this ring to be mostly opal with just enough glow resin to fill in the gaps. So I go ahead and keep adding more opal, a little bit more glow powder. I go back and forth until I get the consistency just how I want it, and you'll see we're left with this really thick, it's almost like concrete at the end. All right, I'll set that first mix aside, and it's time to move on to the second ring, which is just going to be the opal dust. No glow powder for this. I'd maybe experiment with that in the future, especially if you guys want to see it. But for this experiment, I just wanted to leave it plain and simple. I want to get that effect as good as it can be, so that's what we're going to go for. And I'll just go ahead and slowly add in the opal dust until I'm left with the perfect amount. I don't want to go too overboard on this, but I do want there to be plenty in there. So I slowly add it in until I get the consistency just how I want it. Now typically I would be casting these in the standard PVC tube, but for video's sake I wanted to do it in something clear. So I'm using these syringes, we'll cast it in that and that'll show it off really well. All right, in goes the first batch. This one's super thick, if you'll remember, so it does take a second here, and I'm using my popsicle stick to encourage it in, but eventually we get it all in place, and we'll go ahead and move on to the second one. And of course, this is a lot easier. It's just a liquid. I pour it all in, and we're ready to switch over to our vacuum chamber. And if you're unaware, the vacuum chamber's purpose is to completely remove any bubbles or voids from these rings. We want them to be crystal clear and solid all the way through, and the vacuum is what makes that possible. Here's a little rundown of how it works. Essentially, we've got a bucket full of air with this lid on it. My vacuum pump starts removing that air. And so as we get closer and closer to a perfect vacuum, the air that's trapped inside of the rings no longer has any air pressure pushing it downwards and holding it in the ring, so it starts to expand. So you think of a small little just pinhead of a bubble, that's going to expand to be 10 times, 100 times larger. It's going to get so big that it works its way all the way up to the surface of the resin, and it pops, and it takes 5 or 10 minutes. And you can see there's all these bubbles going on. Those started out as just these small micro bubbles in the resin, and once you get all of those out and you add the air pressure back in, it's going to go ahead and crush everything back down. So after 5 to 10 minutes, in theory, we should be left with perfectly void-free, crystal clear results, but I was a little bit concerned about the thicker mixture. It's so thick that it might be tricky to get rid of all of the bubbles. So as a super kind of paranoid added precaution, I'm going to throw them both into the pressure pot. I'm going to fill it with about 50 psi. And this does kind of the exact opposite effect as the vacuum chamber. Instead of expanding and releasing the bubbles, we're essentially just crushing them so small that they're just disappearing. We're crushing them out of existence. And doing both of these is super overkill, but we are going to be pretty much guaranteed to have perfect results at the end. So I definitely don't regret doing it. Now the next day the epoxy is cured and we're ready to begin working on the machining aspect of these and actually shaping them and finishing them into rings. I was actually out of town for this portion, so Everett, one of my master rings craftsmen, is going to be taking over for the rest. First we'll go ahead and machine the cylinder of opal and resin flat. That's going to give us a nice even surface to work with. Now, due to the fact that this material is about 80 or 90% opal, we can't just work with it like we would a normal metal, where we use our tungsten carbide lathe bits and we shave away the material. This is going to be a little bit more fragile, a little bit more like stone. This is going to require a little bit more care, so we're going to be using abrasive methods for the majority of the rest of this process. That's why instead of using a boring bar here, Everett's using a diamond hole saw. That'll gently cut through the material and get us to that inside diameter that we want to start out with. Using a depth gauge, we'll make sure that our cut is deep enough, and then once we've done that, we'll go ahead and mark where we want to cut off the piece. And again, instead of using a cutoff bit, we're going to be using abrasive methods. So we're using a diamond disc in our Dremel. We'll go ahead and gently slice that off. We're left with this ring blank. It's starting to look really cool. We've just got some final shaping and polishing to do and this thing will be finished. Now very, very gently we'll be using a boring bar to slowly widen up that inside diameter. We're going to get it really close to our final size, but we're going to leave just enough room for some sanding and polishing. Now really quickly we'll go ahead and add a comfort finish with the Dremel. We do that to both sides, and then we use our sandpapers from 220 grit all the way to about 2000 grit. That'll leave us with a perfectly smooth finish on the ring. Now we just need to use some of our Astro polish to give us that perfect glossy shine. Now onto the outer diameter, we're essentially going to be repeating those exact same steps. We want to give it a nice dome finish. I think that'll look really nice on this material. All right, here's a little sneak peek at that, but wait until you see this thing in the dark. It's absolutely nuts. First though, we're going to be finishing up the secondary ring, and I'll just breeze through this. Essentially, we use the exact same steps, so I won't go into too much detail, and it's actually a little bit more forgiving to work with. Because it's mostly epoxy instead of the opal, it's a lot more forgiving, and it's a lot easier to work with. All right, here we are finished. Both of these rings turned out really awesome, and honestly, I gotta say I'm a little bit surprised. One of the reasons I wanted to do 2 rings in this project was because I wasn't certain both of them would turn out looking this great. And honestly, I gotta say I love both of them. The first one with those larger fragments and the glow powder, it's such a cool look. It almost looks like a solid opal ring that I've done in the past, but in the nighttime, you just cannot match the coolness of that glow in the dark. I gotta say, I like this a little bit more than even a solid opal ring. Now the second ring, this one turned out awesome as well. Originally, I was hoping that these smaller fragments would essentially dissolve into the epoxy, leaving us with one just kind of solid color haze to the ring, just like you saw in the opalite in the beginning of the video. But what we're actually left with is these more distinct little just kind of sparks of this color. So it's different from what I had in mind, but honestly, I love the result anyways. If you guys want to order any of these, we're going to have them available on the site. And we also have a bunch of different opal color options available as well. So anyways, guys, that's been it for this video. Thank you so much for watching. We'll catch you in the next one.